I've been concerned about this fraud of human-induced climate change for a couple of decades. And there's a few things that are really very clear. It's got nothing to do with science. It's got nothing to do with the environment, and it's all about the money. It is a scam. But that is very hard to argue. So as a scientist of more than 50 years of being a scientist, I try to use simple science to show that this is wrong, and wrong. And a lot of the science is falsified. And there's some very, very simple things to show. The first is that the main greenhouse gas is water vapour. The second thing is that carbon dioxide is plant food. Now, I've given up hugging trees. What I do is I feed them by burning fossil fuels. And there's a very good reason for that. That we have been decreasing in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 0.7% when we had an explosion of life to 0.04%. We do have a carbon crisis. There's not enough carbon dioxide in the air. If you're a horticulturalist, you burn propane and put in the exhaust fumes into your glass house, and that has 3 times the atmospheric content of carbon dioxide, and it also has a very high water vapour content. Carbon dioxide drives life on Earth. If we sequester it or reduce even more the amount of carbon dioxide, then we kill plant life. Now, we have seen already an evolutionary adaptation to plants having less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's when we had the development of C4 plants like sugarcane or maize, corn, many millet, many crops, and things like brassica, broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower that I had tonight. That's between a C3 and a C4. It can't make up its mind yet. So we're already having plants adapting to a decrease in carbon dioxide content. But if we halved it, we would go into the planet's 4th atmosphere. The first atmosphere was methane, ammonia, hydrogen, helium and carbon dioxide rich. The second atmosphere, which lasted for the bulk of time, was carbon dioxide rich. It had up to 20% carbon dioxide. And did we have runaway global warming? No. We had ice ages. And we've had 6 ice ages in the history of this planet. Within that, a glaciation where the ice expands and where we have interglacial where the ice retreats. 6 out of the 6 ice ages started when we had more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than now. So there is a problem. And the problem is that carbon dioxide has never driven climate change in the past. Why should it now? You have to change all the laws of physics and chemistry just because you're alive. Well, narcissism gets to a certain point, but you can't change physics and chemistry. Our 3rd atmosphere was oxygen rich, and we thrive in that atmosphere. And the 4th atmosphere, if we evolve the planet even further and destroy carbon dioxide, reduce it, we will have an atmosphere rich in nitrogen and argon. It will be an inert atmosphere. And this is the reality of the long view of the planet. We had over a dinner discussion some talk about carbon dioxide. 3% of the atmosphere's carbon dioxide is of human origin. Here is the key question. Can you please show me that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. It's never been done. I've asked scientists for this. I've asked media people who abuse me. I've asked activists who abuse me, scientists, especially if they're dependent upon the interests I represent and the money that comes to them, they will obfuscate. But I have asked them, just please give me half a dozen scientific papers that unequivocally show that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. I don't use the word prove, I use the word drive. It's never been done. So everything, all those wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, as net zero, the whole lot is based on a fallacy. Now, assume I'm wrong, perish the thought. Assume that human emissions do drive global warming. You then have to show that the natural emissions, which are 97% of the total, that they don't drive global warming. So it's checkmate before the game starts. The bulk of the world's emissions of carbon dioxide come from volcanoes, and there's a lot in the literature about this, and I get slammed a lot by the rat bags. We know from work that was done at the ANU in Canberra that if you cook up the most common volcanic rock on planet Earth, then it will dissolve gases. Now we have 1,800 volcanoes sticking above the ground. Most of those are a rock called andesite, comes from the Andes. And you can lower the melting point and lower the crystallization of that melt if you have water dissolved in the magma, in the molten rock. But you cannot dissolve carbon dioxide in that molten rock. So the bulk of the world's visible volcanoes don't emit carbon dioxide. Yet those are the ones that are measured. And those are the ones that the IPC say, oh no, there's no carbon dioxide coming out of the volcanoes. Well, how the hell do we get an atmosphere on the planet if it hasn't leaked out from deep in the earth? So
it's the second most common volcanic gas after water vapour.
After water vapour.
Right?
Yeah.
There is carbon dioxide.
Ah, yeah, I'm coming to that. Yeah, you're a bit smarter than me, you're a bit quicker. 70% of the planet is covered by oceans. On the floor of the oceans, we have basalt volcanoes. Instead of 1,800 of them, we've counted 3.4 million of them. Now, we've also done experiments on basalts. This has mainly been done in Chicago and Göttingen in Germany. And you get a basalt and you cook it up and you work out how much water can dissolve in it. Very little. That's why basalt volcanoes are not explosive. The occasional rare ones in Western Victoria, they weren't big enough, but the occasional ones will explode when they have absorbed a bit of water from a lake, a crater lake, or from the oceans, like in Galapagos or in Hawaii. But the main gas which dissolves in molten basalt is carbon dioxide. And the experiments show that up to 13.5% by weight of that gas will dissolve in a molten basalt. The bulk of the ocean floor is basalt. New basalts are forming when you're pulling apart the ocean floor. We get depressurisation deep in the mantle, we get partial melting of the mantle, and up comes a basalt charged with gas, which makes it buoyant, and it rises. Now that gas boils off well before that volcano erupts. And when we sample those volcanic rocks, they've got very little carbon dioxide in them. But they must have had a lot of carbon dioxide in them to rise and to melt at those temperatures. So we deduce that the bulk of the world's carbon dioxide has come from basalt volcanoes. These are submarine volcanoes. You do not see that gas bubbling up to the surface because carbon dioxide dissolves in high pressure, cool, saline bottom waters of the ocean. And later, when that is upwelled to the surface, it will degas into the atmosphere. So The bulk of the volcanic gases we see are water vapour. The second most abundant one is carbon dioxide. Some of them, quite interestingly, have methane, hence the ideas about non-biological oil. But carbon dioxide is a major gas. Now, that goes into the atmosphere and it is recycled. It is recycled principally by life. That's why our early atmosphere had 20% carbon dioxide. And as soon as we had critters that made calcium carbonate shells, as soon as we had limestone reefs, as soon as we had organic rich muds, vegetation giving us coal, critters giving us oil, then we started to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we went down from 20% at the explosion of life. We had 0.7%, mainly drawn down by algal matter, and we're now at 0.04%. So it is a fundamental gas for the behaviour of the degassing of the planet. We find carbon dioxide, as we find many other gases, we find carbon dioxide on the other planets. We've actually found carbon dioxide in stellar disks outside our solar system. It is a fundamental gas to our system. The other subject we mentioned at the table was a 1.5 degrees Celsius change, how it's going to kill you. Well, if you walk outside, the temperature will rise more than 1.5 Celsius. What's the range between being inside and outside, from one room to another, from summer to winter? Do people in Finland who emigrated to Mount Isa, where they have 43 degree summers, did they die from the heat? And underground at Mount Isa, it is hot. It's one of the hottest mines in the country. So we know, just from looking at human experience, that those sort of temperature ranges don't kill you. And for some time I've had a number of people asking me, can you please write something for children? And can you please try to give something such that we can deprogram the nonsense that our kids are being fed at school? And I have a habit of being incarcerated every now and then. I was incarcerated for almost a year in 2020, again this year for 3 months. And I started to write this trilogy for children. The hard one to write was for the kids from 8 to 12 years old. Bit easier for teenagers from 12 to 16 because I run boot camps for 16-year-old feral kids. I know how they think. I know what concerns them. I know how the girls are narcissistic and the boys don't give a bugger about anything. You've all had teenagers, you know what it's like. And then dealing with the ones after 16 who I taught at university. These are people who come in and know everything about the environment and the way the planet works until you give them a few facts. So the first one was written for ankle biters with a lot of pictures in it, little coloured areas and little did you knows. But what's going to persuade a young kid, an 8 to 12 year old, about net zero and about climate? Money. And what really makes an 8-year-old laugh? And it's farts. So I tried to write this around farts, poo, wee, earwax and boogers, and looking at the carbon cycle. So when you eat, you're eating carbon compounds. They are then used to make your body grow. But you get rid of carbon compounds. You breathe out carbon dioxide. You breathe in I don't use these figures for 8-year-olds, but you breathe in 0.04% and you breathe out 4%. So I tell them, look, you breathe out 100 times what you breathe in. If carbon dioxide is a poison, try it out on your favourite auntie. Go and give her a big kiss. And if it kills her, then carbon dioxide is a poison. If not, then you're being fed rubbish. So I go into some of the fundamentals. Now, kids, especially living in cities, don't know where their food comes from. And I use the word cookies. I deliberately used an American word because they pick up that word from the media. And how do you make a cookie? Well, you've got to grow wheat. You've got to use fertiliser. You've got to make the fertiliser. You can't use cow dung. There's not enough of it. And so I go into, in an 8-year-old's language, how we can start with food and we metabolise the food, not a word I use, and how we create that food by using fossil fuels. And I point out that you need a farmer for every meal you have. You can't live without a farmer. And how do people farm? They use diesel for ploughing, for seeding, for weeding, for harvesting, for processing, for transporting the food to you in a city. And if you didn't have diesel, you wouldn't have food. A pretty fundamental thing for kids. So I've got pictures of how various plants metabolise, how food is manufactured, how if you have too much food you can vomit, how a lot of other people don't have the food you have. Pictures of how the stomach works. Kids don't know these things. How you metabolise food. And really simple things like scientific experiments. So here's a scientific experiment for boys. Find a private place and wee on the same plant as many times as you can over a period of a few months. Will the plant grow or die? Do the experiment. Some of you lads have done that, I have. So we know the answer to that. And then down the yellow box down the right, I explain why wee is yellow. And it's yellow because of chemicals formed in the blood, and they break down and they give you yellow chemicals. And if your wee is too yellow, you haven't drunk enough water. There's a health tip for them. So I've wound that into the story. And then another section here, I've got poo or die. And it's basically very simple. If you don't eat, you don't poo, and if you don't poo, you die. And I point out that a teaspoonful of poo contains 50 million viruses, 5 million bacteria, 5,000 parasite cysts and 500 parasite eggs. Don't eat it. Go hungry instead. And then I go into why we have certain health procedures now, why we don't use spoons to eat made out of bone or wood. We use them out of metal, and this goes back to a book that I wrote a while ago about a spoon, and pointing out that you have some 700 million people in the world who poo outside. They don't have the luxury you have. These people are poor. So what do you want to do? Do you want to save energy and poo outside, or do you want to have a more hygienic system? I have them doing experiments with cow poo if they can find it. But then I get on to the part which kids just roll around laughing with, and this was validated by my 7-year-old grandson, lives in Montreal, and I was talking to him on FaceTime, and he held up his latest book to me, and it was a book his mother had bought him, my daughter-in-law, and the title of the book was Do Girls Fart? And he was whimpering with laughter, and I thought, yes, I've hit it right. So I go into the amount of waste we produce. I go into the fact that the first fart jokes we ever saw were on Sumerian clay tablets, which are 4,000 years old. And why farts are loud? Why dogs don't have loud farts, but how dogs really know what they're doing. And dogs will fart and then get up and slowly walk away. And if you've got a dog, they do it. And dogs know. They don't make a noise, but they know. Pointing out why you shouldn't try to stop a fart, because the gas goes back into your bloodstream and it eventually goes into your lungs and comes out in your breath. And going into things that you shouldn't try at home, and I go into how you shouldn't try to light a fart, and a scientific experiment here in blue, and it is, how do I stink out the whole bus on a school excursion? Eat as many eggs as possible. Eat cabbage, then wait for the action to start and look at which friend you can blame. Some people drop a smelly fart just as the doors of an elevator shut. There is no escape. Don't even try this with your friends, which of course for an 8-year-old is a provocation to go and do it. And then I challenge the kids to be the fart king of the school. With certain farts, there are some that smell like rotten cabbage, some that smell like rotting seaweed, and how these have got certain chemicals in it. So there's the rotten cabbage smell is due to methyl mercaptan. If the smell is like rotten seaweed, then tell your classmates it's due to dimethyl sulfide. They will think of you as a school's fart genius. And I point out that, you know, these farts would kill a dead elephant, and I've got a picture of a girl and a boy there farting at an elephant that's already dead. So kids love farts, and I go into the chemistry of farts, which is quite interesting actually. And then I go into earwax, which is, again, the body excreting carbon compounds, and I just couldn't miss this. I had to put this in here. And I have a section here that says, there is a video of a man eating his own earwax in the Australian Parliament. Yuck! He later became Australian Prime Minister. Could you become Prime Minister if you eat earwax in public? Do an internet search using the words Rudd earwax eat. Check it out. There's a video of it. Check it out. You can't resist that one. And then I talk about snot and how it's really essential to have snot. If you've got snot, you're pretty healthy. But also point out why snot has got a taste to it. All kids eat snot, and why snot's coloured. And then a little scientific experiment here in blue that you can do in snot. Roll a booger flat and look at it under a microscope. There may be hair and tiny pieces of dust, but each year 80,000 tonnes of dust falls onto the Earth from outer space. If you're very lucky, you might have a piece of this extraterrestrial dust in your booger. Not many people are lucky enough to have aliens in their boogers. And you know, that's true. There's 80,000 tonnes that falls here. There's a chance of a big being in your snot. Give it a go. And then I point out a few fundamentals about without carbon, there's no life. No plants, no animals, no food, no you. And I point out that we had years ago, hundreds of years ago, forests were clear felled to make charcoal, to make glass and to make steel. And then we discovered that we could use coal. And it was coal that saved the forests of Europe and North America and England. I then point out that we'd used oil, whale oil, for hundreds of years in lanterns. And then it was discovered that it was cheaper and better to use mineral oil, fossil fuel, to use mineral oil in lanterns. It was a fossil fuel that saved the whales, not the greenies. It was fossil fuel. And I talk about when we first had motor cars. Those were the times when the streets were knee deep in horse poo. That would wash into wells. People would drink water from the wells. They would get very, very sick. And I point out that once we got rid of horse poo in the streets, by having fossil fuel driven cars, people stopped getting sick. It was fossil fuels that created the health that we enjoy today. So these are fundamentals that kids will never ever learn at school. And I talk about where carbon is everywhere, in the rocks, in the soils, etc. And I point out, I finish up by talking about net zero, how you couldn't possibly be alive in a net zero world. And there's only one way to deal with this, but I'm trying to tell these young kids that carbon is part of your body. It's part of the food. You excrete carbon in your breath, in every other excreta. And without carbon, you are dead. And I don't want to, with 8-year-old kids, tell them that their teachers are either ignorant or telling them lies or both. It's a bit hard on an 8-year-old, but that's the aim of the exercise. But for slightly older kids, and most of us would know how teenagers think, there's a couple of things teenagers think about. They often say, oh, it's not fair. So I go into that. Yeah, if it's a press, tell them I'm unavailable. I'm busy.
It's Kevin Rudd.
He's looking after your interests in Washington, God help us. So teenagers are worried that the world's going to end. So I go into the climate catastrophe that we're facing, or the climate emergency, and just point out using simple graphs that the temperature over time, any variation that's measured today is within variability. There's nothing special about today. I point out that wildfires over time have decreased. Yes, the property damage has increased because we're wealthier and we build places close to nature in the forests, which get wiped out. Our tornadoes, hurricanes and cyclones have decreased. And yes, the insurance bills have gone up because we build flash houses now, because we've got the money, we didn't 100 years ago. We build them on the waterfront, and that's when we get wiped out. So I look at the planet in crisis. Is the planet really in crisis? And just with this level of kids, I look at bar diagrams and graphs showing that the climate-related deaths have decreased enormously over the last 100 years. So much so that you've got far more exotic ways of dying than through a climate death. And so I start this by looking at fires, I then look at timber, I look at floodplains. Have you ever wondered why they're called a floodplain? I mean, there's layers and layers and layers and layers of material from flooding. Out here on the Nepean River, we've had flooding for 55 million years. We have had massive flooding, and we've got boulders there, material that have come from the Goulburn area. We can trace these boulders to where they came from. That is a floodplain. And once you build on a floodplain, you change the proportion of runoff to absorption. And so no wonder it's going to flood. And then I go into the word unprecedented, how these floods are unprecedented. Well, they're unprecedented if you look back over the last 10 years. But if you look back over the last 200 years or 1,000 years or million years, they're not unprecedented at all. They're expected and they're quite normal. And I look at temperature trends over time, like this one here, nothing to get worried about. There's no climate emergency. You're being fed absolute total rubbish. So the first thing to do is to stop kids worrying about the dramatic end of the world scenarios that they are being given. Then I look at a graph here at what has happened in our latest period of climate change. We had an interglacial between 128,000 and 116,000 years ago. Sea level was about 7 metres higher than now. Temperature was about 5 degrees warmer than now. Then we started to cool down. And we started to cool down because the planet got further away from the sun. And that got sped up by a supervolcano, Toba in Indonesia. And that filled the atmosphere with dust, reflected light and heat. Vegetation died. Tropical communities moved north and south. That's when you had the first of many invasions of Aboriginals into this country, about 74,000 years ago. And that's quite normal. And we've been cooling and cooling and cooling and cooling and cooling. We're at the peak of the last glaciation 20,000 years ago. And that ended 14,700 years ago. Since then, we've been warming up with a couple of cold periods, 2 very intense cold periods, but we've been warming up, and we reached the peak of our interglacial 7,000 to 4,000 years ago. And unless you can change the distance of the planet from the sun, then you're not going to change what's happening. And for the last 4,000 years, we have been cooling. And within that cooling, we've had peaks of warming, like in Minoan times, like in Roman times, like in medieval times, and peaks when it was cooler, like in the Dark Ages or the Little Ice Age. So then I pose the question, well, if someone asks you or tells you, oh, you know, this is the hottest summer we've had, the answer is you've got to say, since when? Because it has actually warmed up since the Little Ice Age. It's cooled down since the medieval warming. It's warmed up since the time of the Vikings. It's cooled since the time of Jesus. So when are you going to start counting? And if you say it's the hottest ever, then you're telling lies. You've got to look at it over time and look at climate cycles. So this is to tell kids that there are cycles that we know very well. And then I go into the last cycle where we came out of the medieval warming in 1280 AD. In 1303 AD, the Gulf of Bothnia was frozen. That's the water between Finland and Sweden. And we entered the Little Ice Age. We had the most miserable cold times when we had a lack of sunspot activity in the Little Ice Age. And I look at the last one, the Maunder Minimum. And in the Maunder Minimum, I've got a lovely graph here plotting temperature against the number of witches who were rounded up and killed. There's a very good correlation. And as soon as we came out of the Maunder Minimum, as soon as we came out of that very cold period, we stopped rounding up witches. Now, we rounded up witches because we all knew that the crop failures were due to witches. It wasn't due to the cold temperature. The witches were making the temperature cold. So we rounded them up and burnt them. And what happened after that? Temperature went up. Absolute proof. Witches cause global warming. So this is an exercise of logic for teenage kids. But that, then I add a longer period of time, the history lesson, and I look at the last 500 million years where we see 4 major ice ages. And we see that for 80% of time, it's been warmer and wetter than now. For 80% of time, sea level's been higher than now. Now we've had 5 major mass extinctions of life and more than 20 minor mass extinctions of life. And you're living in a period of extinction. Well, you always do, because there's species turnover. There's more species living now than there were 1,000 years ago. We're increasing the number of species. We're not wiping them out. Yes, we see the macrofauna get wiped out, but that's because they were easy prey for hunters. But we are living in great times. But I also show on this diagram that for the last 50 million years, we've been cooling down. So much so that we entered our most recent ice age 34 million years ago when we had ice in Antarctica, and we're still in an ice age. Ice ages are when you have ice on the poles. And I then look at a well-known diagram of the cycles of climate and how these are driven by the orbit. And so where we are now in the history of time is we're in a very small interglacial. It's not as warm as the previous interglacials, and that carbon dioxide has nothing to do with it. And if you really want to get concerned about pollution, then worry about things like water pollution or plastic pollution or visual pollution or soil contamination. I have a big list there. So we again try to dispel some of the myths that the kids are told. Then I go into what teenagers often say, oh, it's not fair. And I say, well, look, here you are, swanning around in your electric vehicle, feeling morally superior to those dreadful environmentally damaging peasants who are driving an internal combustion engine. Now, we tried electric vehicles in the 1830s. They failed. We tried them 100 to 120 years ago. They failed. For the same reason they're failing now. They're too heavy, and we just don't make electric cords 500 kilometres long. So, And some of you might have watched Bathurst last weekend. Now, Bathurst, they did the 1,000 kilometres in 6 hours, 3 fuel stops. I'd love to see a Bathurst with electric vehicles. It'd be a week-long event.
Bathurst 100.
Yeah. I mean, you see them fuel up and change the wheels and change the discs on a vehicle in 20 seconds. You can't even find an electric charger for your vehicle in 20 seconds. So that's absolute nonsense. But then I point out in these electric vehicles that you people are swanning around feeling superior. But in that vehicle is the metal cobalt. And to mine that metal cobalt, something I raised about 4 years ago on Corey Bernardi's show, and since then people have got onto it, but that is mined by children. In the Congo, these are black slave children your age, providing you with the commodities so you can feel morally superior. Does that make you feel good? So I'm trying to get at the morality that kids are developing at that age. I also look at the morality of their plight of the forests. Now, I've given up hugging trees. I feed them food by driving an internal combustion engine or flying in an aeroplane. It's a greater cause than hugging a tree because it does something for them. And I point out that in Canada there were 318 billion trees. They release 7.6 billion tonnes, they use 7.6 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide as food each year. Canadians release 545 million tonnes. So Canada's already at net zero. Yes. I do the sums for the US, same thing. I do the sums for Australia, same things. I do the sums for the world. And the world is 72 billion tonnes is emitted by plants, and humans emit 37 billion tonnes. So we're already at net zero. The question is, where does the other carbon dioxide come from? Well, it's obviously the degassing of the oceans. So I go into some of the fallacies that these kids get fed, like the lungs of the planet. Now, the lungs of the planet, we all know, are the Brazilian rainforest. And we want to go there and hug a balsa tree, which we're going to chop down and use for the laminates in panels, in the laminates in wind turbines. We want to hug a tree. But the Amazon isn't the lungs of the earth. It's green slime in the oceans. So go and hug green slime if you really want to care about the planet. So I'm basically trying to tell the kids that carbon dioxide is a friend. It's not a foe. And a lot of what you're being fed is absolutely and totally incorrect. I go into sea levels, pointing out that we've known for 170 years now, 190 years should I say, that sea levels go up and down, sea levels change enormously, and that in the Pacific atolls, these atolls form on top of volcanic plugs. The volcanic plugs sink and the atoll keeps growing. That's the same as the sea level rise. Now, we checked that out. Charles Lyell wrote a book about this in 1833 in the Principles of Geology. Charles Darwin was fascinated with this and he checked it out at Tuvalu and he wrote a book about it in 1842. You people in New South Wales, you spent tax dollars, and actually well spent, checking on climate change in Tuvalu and partially funded a drill hole that went down over 1,000 feet at Tuvalu to try to hit the volcano beneath. Didn't hit it, was still in coral. And it wasn't until we had the atomic testing on the Bikini Atoll that we were able to drill down thousands of feet and eventually hit the basalt volcano. And so we have shown that what we've known since 1833, and that is volcanoes subside and the coral keeps growing, has now been validated by satellite work on 1,100 atolls in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, showing that we're not getting these island nations inundated, they're actually growing. And what you're being fed is absolutely wrong. And there's plenty of information to show that that's wrong. So again, trying to show that what you're being told about sea level is probably not right. I give them the examples of the biblical city of Ephesus, which I've been to. Some of you would have been there. It's inland, it's above sea level, but it was a port. It was a Roman port mentioned in the Bible. I've also been to the city of Lydia, just south of Ephesus, and I've been down the main street of Lydia in a yacht, because the town of Lydia was beneath me. So parts of the world go up and down. Sea level goes up and down, and it goes up and down very quickly. We had 5 kilometres of ice on top of Scandinavia, less on top of Scotland, and that ice is now melted. The weight of the ice pushed the land down. Now the land is lifting. Scandinavia has risen 340 metres, Scotland is rising. As a counterbalance, southeastern England and Holland are sinking. So tell me about sea level change. Unless you can tell me about land level change, anything you say about sea level change is absolute garbage, and you have to be careful how you measure it. There was a paper that came out about 15 years ago about the measuring station at Port Adelaide, which was a post out in the harbour, and it was shown that sea level was rising, but later work showed that the post was sinking. So you have to be very careful of measurement. So go right back to first principles. How was it measured? Who measured it? What were the orders of accuracy? What numbers were thrown out? What were kept? So
Adelaide was man-made sea level rise because they took too much groundwater out and the whole thing sank.
Well, that's happening in Mexico City. It's happening in all through the Mississippi Valley. It's happening in many areas, and left Adelaide Airport today. Adelaide Airport's about 1.5 metres above sea level, as is Cairns, as is Townsville, as is Brisbane, as is parts of Sydney Airport, which aren't reclaimed land. 6,000 years ago, at the peak of our interglacial, they were underwater. So tell me about sea level change. You have to get this into perspective, which is the message I'm trying to give the kids. I then give them a few little horror stories about lithium batteries, which is pretty exciting stuff, and why ferry companies and car park owning companies will not insure you if you have lithium batteries there, how they explode, how it's a chemical reaction, how you can't put them out, and basically pointing out that a lot of the stuff you're getting fed is probably not correct. And the last one, which is for Twenties and Wrinkles, this is the post-16, is basically a summary of the first year lectures that I used to give at the University of Melbourne, and putting it in a very compact form, just looking at the history of the planet, and look at the history of climates, the history of extinctions, the history of ice ages coming and going, and how when you look at what's happening today in the perspective of the past, then you've got nothing to be worried about. And so if you ignore the past, you end up with the absolute mess that we're in at present. And in this book, I again go into electric vehicles. I call that section Fads, Fashions, Fools and Fires. Nice alliteration there. I go into fossil fuels, how we've just been increasing the amount of fossil fuels that we've been burning, but it's still at over 80%, and it has been for over 120 years. So the actual impact of solar and wind is absolutely zilch. Welcome to the good guys. Yeah, you've raised your status coming in here. So this one's written for a more mature audience, but basically these books are written for parents and for grandparents, such that they can either give to or read to their kids or grandkids, to try to deprogram the sort of rubbish that these kids are being fed at schools, to try to actually give them some information which is the absolute opposite. And I give the kids here a few questions to ask their teachers, questions which are unanswerable. And they're the sort of questions you've got to give teachers. So this was written to try to, again, change the way people think. It's difficult to tell children that you've been lied to. by your teachers. It's difficult to tell children that your teachers are ignorant. It's difficult to tell teachers that this has got nothing to do with climate, it's got nothing to do with the environment, it's got nothing to do with what you're told. It's all about forces out there trying to make a quid out of new opportunities which government mandates have opened up for them. So that for kids who don't have to earn money and pay off a mortgage, they don't understand money, so you can't use financial arguments. I've used the moral arguments, and I've used arguments of logic, and in the first book used arguments of humour about bodily functions, of farting, etc., to try to get kids interested in how the planet works. I deserve a sip of wine, and I think you need some questions.